Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Justin D'Souza. I'm a quantitative specialist here at Statistics Solutions. During today's webinar, we are going to discuss the construction and development of quantitative research questions and hypotheses. So I'm going to go through the entire presentation first, and if we have any questions, we will do a Q&A session at the end. So you can type your questions into the chat box or the Q&A box. My colleague Sierra is providing hyperlinks in the chat box as well, with dissertation resources and our webinar archives, and even links to schedule consultations if you have any questions about one-on-one assistance. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so we'll start out. I'll give a brief overview of the services that we provide at our company. Then we'll dive into today's topic about constructing quantitative research questions. We'll conclude with a summary and a Q&A session. On this slide, you can see all the different parts of the dissertation journey that our company assists with, starting with topic development and going all the way to final defense. So we have quantitative and qualitative methodologists that can assist you. And we also have literature review specialists. So if you need help framing your research questions, developing a data analysis plan, figuring out what's the best instrumentation to address your research questions, we can help you in those areas. We also have assistance with IRB forms, data entry templates. We can host a survey for you on SurveyMonkey. We have our own company account. And we assist with the interpretation of results, and we can help you present it in APA format according to your school's template. And then with the final components, we help with the discussion, PowerPoints for the proposal and final defenses. And we can help you condense your dissertation into a journal so you can submit it to a publication. If you have any questions, you can give us a call here at 727-442-4290, and we will be sending everybody a copy of the webinar today and the PowerPoint. On this slide, you can see the list of the webinars we have done in the past. So you can view the recordings at the archive link, and you can see what webinars we will be doing in the future at the top link here. Okay, so before you even begin developing your research questions, you first need to identify a research problem. Essentially, what is the gap in the literature? You want to find a topic that has not been explored before. That's a really important component, is that you make your study unique. So a review of the literature should be one of the first steps you make in identifying your research objective. Then once you've developed and determined your research problem and your purpose statement and your problem statement, you'll want to pinpoint if you want to go in a quantitative direction or a qualitative direction. You can also do a mixed method study potentially. Not something I would highly recommend, as it becomes a little complex and it can add months to the process. So try to pinpoint either a quantitative design or a qualitative design. Quantitative sounds exactly like what it is. It involves using numbers and statistics to prove hypotheses, whereas qualitative is looking at concepts and understanding underlying themes and perceptions of participants. Qualitative usually involves interviewing participants. So you have open-ended responses, whereas quantitative, you have an objective questionnaire, or you have a Likert scale questionnaire. You have numeric values in your data set. Okay, then once you pinpoint the research design, the research problem, and you have identified a gap in the literature, you'll want to create a list of all the variables of interest for your study. Identify if these variables are numerically measurable. Do you plan to use a self-report survey? Something like the MLQ, the job satisfaction survey, something that measures a perception of participants? Or are you planning to use archival data, hospital records or census data, Want to pinpoint one of those two methods. Usually don't use both. You don't want to use a survey and archival data, as it's very difficult to combine the responses from a survey and previous research. So I highly recommend looking for a self-report survey that is validated already. You don't want to create your own questionnaire, as you have to prove that it is a valid survey. You'll have to do a pilot test, and you'll have to run some complex analyses to prove that the survey is in fact valid. So to save time, look for something that has been established as a reliable and valid tool. And you want to pinpoint your specific quantitative research design. We're focusing on quantitative today. We do have webinars that focus on qualitative as well, but today we're just focusing on quantitative research designs and research questions. So these are the four most common designs I see used in quantitative research, specifically for dissertations in the social sciences and psychology fields, and even in medicine. So they're pretty overarching in terms of the field. So we have descriptive, exploratory designs, we have correlational designs, we have experimental, quasi-experimental, and causal comparative. These all kind of go into one block. And we have longitudinal designs. So let's break these down. A descriptive or exploratory design is not necessarily trying to prove or disprove hypotheses. This is a very simplistic design that is just looking for trends. It's looking for trends in how people respond to certain perceptions or certain variables. You know, if you give a survey like the job satisfaction survey, you're not connecting job satisfaction to another variable. You're just looking at perceptions of job satisfaction among your sample. Likewise, if you're looking at leadership, something like leadership or self-efficacy or motivation, if you're just trying to describe the participants' perceptions, then that would be an exploratory design. These designs are considered too simplistic at some universities because you're not running an inferential analysis, you know, like a correlation or a t-test or an ANOVA or a regression model. You're just looking at means and standard deviations or frequencies and percentages. So it can be a little too simplistic, but if your committee is okay with it and they're on board, 100%, I would say go with this method because it's very straightforward. You only have to run a few analyses. Okay. And then our next design is a correlational design. A correlational design is looking at the relationship between two variables of interest. So we have correlational analyses and we have regression analyses. Correlation analyses are looking at two-way associations, meaning that you don't need to have an independent and a dependent variable. And I should go back, you know, that even applies to the descriptive design. The first one here, you don't need independent and dependent variables. You just need variables of interest. And if you're doing a correlational analysis, you also don't need to have independent and dependent variables. It's a two-way relationship. So as you can see with these sample research questions, for instance, is there a significant relationship between X and Y? You can substitute your two variables for X and Y, age and self-efficacy, or education and job position. And the idea with correlations is that you're looking at a vice versa relationship. You know, as age increases, what happens to self-efficacy? Or as self-efficacy increases, what happens to age? It works both ways. That's why you don't need an independent and dependent variable. The most common analyses used underneath this design are the Pearson correlation, the Spearman correlation, and chi-square tests. The selection of which approach to use is dependent on the level of measurement for your variable. So if you have two continuous variables, you know, something like weight or BMI or age, and you're correlating those concepts together, that's when you do a Pearson correlation. But if you have an ordinal measurement, something like education level, because there's a hierarchy to it. You have high school, associate's, bachelor's, master's, PhD. That's a multiple choice that goes up a ladder. That's when you use a Spearman correlation. Then a chi-square test is used when you have two categorical variables. So something like gender, ethnicity, passing and failing an exam. That's when you do a chi-square. Here we have some sample research questions, the same research questions as the previous slide, but I've added the hypotheses here. So whenever you do an inferential analysis, you want to have a null hypothesis, which is the top one here, and you want an alternative hypothesis, which is the bottom one. All it takes is rephrasing your research question. You take your research question and you turn it into a statement. The null is usually indicating that we are not finding a significant relationship, whereas the alternative, signified by the A here, is indicating that we do or are anticipating a significant relationship. And the other branch to a correlational design is the predictive approach. So this is where you do need independent and dependent variables. When you do a regression analysis, which is what you do for prediction, you need to have an independent, which is called a predictor, and you need a dependent variable, which is often called a criterion variable. You can see the sample research questions here. They're very similar to the previous ones. What is the predictive relationship between X and Y? So that predictive language is very important. As soon as you see predictive, that will imply we need to run regression models, most likely. So you can see some sample research questions here and the analyses that are most common for regression models. The first research question here, is there a significant predictive relationship between age and self-efficacy? We only have one predictor here, which is age. And usually the predictor is listed first, followed by the criterion. If you only have one predictor, that's called a linear or just a simple linear regression. And the type of regression model, similar to the correlations here, remember we looked at Pearson, Spearman, chi-square, the type of regression you run is also dependent on the level of measurement you are examining. So when we do a linear regression, we need to have a continuous outcome or a continuous dependent variable. So if you're trying to predict test scores, or you're trying to predict from a Likert scale survey, a job satisfaction score, that's when you do a linear regression. And if you have only one predictor, as we do here with age, you just run what's called a simple linear regression. The second example here, you can see I added multiple predictors: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, personal accomplishment. Those are measured on one survey called the Maslach burnout inventory. So if you look at all three of these factors, that's when you run what's called a multiple linear regression, meaning we're just putting all three predictors in simultaneously. A logistic regression, and specifically a binary logistic regression, is used when you have an outcome or a dependent variable that only has two levels. Binary, it usually implies two. So if you have an outcome like we have for research question 3 here, is there a significant predictive relationship between GPA and passing and failing an exam? Passing and failing an exam is dichotomous, or it's binary. You can either pass or you fail, and there's not an in-between. That's when you run a binary logistic regression. A multinomial logistic regression is an extension off of a binary regression, but you have more than two groups. Okay, so if it wasn't passing and failing an exam, but say you're trying to predict group membership, or if you're trying to predict someone's education level or ethnicity, that's when you usually run a multinomial logistic regression. And finally, we have ordinal logistic regression, which is used when your outcome is an ordinal measurement. So that's a better example for if education was your outcome, you're trying to predict how does GPA predict education level, something like that, then because education has multiple levels that go up a ladder, that's when you would do an ordinal logistic regression. On the next slide here, we have the null and alternative hypotheses. And very similar to the previous example with the correlations, but we've added the predictive language because we're doing regression models. And you have the null, which assumes there is not a significant relationship. And then you have the alternative, as there is a significant predictive relationship. Usually the purpose, and when you run statistics, you're trying to disprove your null hypothesis. The terminology is usually you reject the null hypothesis or you fail to reject the null hypothesis. Okay, our third design here are experimental, quasi-experimental, causal comparative designs. The key word that applies to these designs is the word differences. So we're not looking at relationships so much or predictive relationships. We're looking at differences in variables between groups. So again, for this, you do need an independent variable and you need a dependent variable. The independent variable is usually your grouping factor. What groups are you looking for differences between? Males and females, different ethnicities, grade level, things like that. And the dependent variable is specifically the value or the variable that you want to test for differences between. That could be, job satisfaction again, motivation, leadership style, things like that. So here we have some sample research questions for an experimental type design. And you phrase it, you usually put the dependent variable first. So the language, the order of the variables is a little bit different. So we would say, is there a significant difference in Y, which is your dependent variable, between the groups of X? Okay, for example, is there a significant difference in job satisfaction between the treatment and control groups? Is there a significant difference in self-efficacy based on race? So each of these research questions ties to a specific analysis. As soon as I read these questions, there is a specific approach that can be used to address those questions. And what you have to do is look at the level of measurement of your variables and how many variables you have. For the first example here, sample question 1, let's pinpoint what we have. We have one dependent variable of job satisfaction, and we have 2 independent groups, treatment and control. For this research question, you can use an independent sample t-test. Is used when you're testing for differences in a continuous variable between 2 groups. 2 groups is the very important distinction here. If you only have 2 groups, then you do an independent sample t-test. If you have 3 or more groups, that's when you do an analysis of variance, which is an ANOVA for short. And that would apply to sample question 2. Is there a significant difference in self-efficacy based on race? So assuming we have 3 or more races, say white, Black, Asian, Hispanic, other, that's when you can run an ANOVA. And the key thing for this is that we still only have one dependent variable, self-efficacy. Once you add multiple dependent variables, so you want to look at multiple factors simultaneously, by race, in this example, we have emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, personal accomplishment. That's when you run a MANOVA, which is a multivariate analysis of variance. So the multivariate means that you have multiple dependent variables. So again, we have 3 dependent variables for this example, and we have 1 independent variable that has at least 3 groups. That's when you run a MANOVA. Then our final example is very similar to the previous one, but we're controlling for an additional factor. We're holding job satisfaction constant. So are there differences in these factors by race while accounting for or controlling for job satisfaction? So this is where you run an ANCOVA. So the C for ANCOVA and MANCOVA stands for covariance, an analysis of covariance, and a multivariate analysis of covariance. So you're just adding an additional factor that you are holding constant. Here we have the sample questions. And very similar to the research question, okay, so again, you add the there is not a significant difference language for the null, and then there is a significant difference for the alternative. For this example here, for sample question 2, you might want to have sub-hypotheses. You notice that we don't have just a null and an alternative. What I did is I created a separate hypothesis for each dependent variable, one for emotional exhaustion by race, one for depersonalization by race, and one for personal accomplishment. Because you might see different results for each factor. You want to have a separate hypothesis for each one. Final design type we have here is a longitudinal design, and this is when you're collecting data over a period of time. So maybe you're collecting data at a certain time at a baseline or a pre-test, and you administer an intervention, and then you give the same survey or you collect the same measurements at post-test. You want to see, is there a difference over time? That's when you do a longitudinal design. This also goes into experimental designs a bit. So you can have a pre and post, but you also have a treatment and control group. Okay, so that's where it gets a little more complicated, where you have a lot of moving parts. You have a difference over time, and you have differences between groups. We can examine that a little bit more here. We have 3 sample questions. Is there a significant difference in knowledge between pre-test and post-test? Educational intervention. So usually you need to collect data at baseline or pre-test knowledge, and then you administer your intervention. And then it's very important that the same participants are coming back to take the post-test. So attrition is usually a big concern for this, is that some people might not return. That's something to keep in mind, because you need the data to match. The same people need to take pre and post. So for this first sample question, because we only have 2 points in time and we have 1 dependent variable, you would use a paired sample t-test, which is also called a dependent sample t-test. This assesses for differences in a continuous dependent variable between 2 points in time. Okay, knowledge is our dependent variable, and the 2 points in time are pre-test and post-test. We can extend on that by adding another time point. So say you have baseline, post-test, and then at some point in the future, you do a follow-up with the same people and the same questionnaire, or the same survey. So knowledge at baseline, knowledge at post-test, knowledge at follow-up for the same sample. That's when you do a repeated measures ANOVA. So that's used when you have 3 or more points in time. And then finally, we have differences in a variable over time and between groups. So this is a true experimental design. Usually you randomly assign people to a treatment group and a control group. You administer a survey at baseline, and then you run your intervention, and then the same people come back for the post-test. But you want to see if there's a difference between your treatment and control group. That's when you do a mixed model ANOVA. And we'll break that down. We'll break that down a little bit here. Here we have the sample hypotheses. Same logic. There is not a significant difference in knowledge over time between baseline, post-test, and follow-up. And then the alternative is that there is a significant difference. Now for the mixed model ANOVA example, so is there a significant difference in knowledge over time and between groups? There are 3 things to consider, 3 effects you need to examine. Is there a difference in knowledge over time? That needs 1 hypothesis. is there a difference over time, or I'm sorry, is there a difference in knowledge between groups? That's a second hypothesis. And then is there a significant difference over time and between groups? That is usually the interaction. So if you have a pre-test and a post-test, a treatment and a control group, this is usually how the hypotheses could be set up. This final one is usually the most important because you have 4 moving parts. You have treatment pre-test, control pre-test, treatment post-test, control post. So it's testing for differences among those 4 possibilities. So in summary, the first thing you want to do is identify a gap in the literature, pinpoint your problem statement and purpose statement, then identify if quantitative or qualitative methods are going to be best to address your purpose statement, then pinpoint the variables of interest. How is each variable going to be measured? Is it going to be a nominal measurement, which means categories, essentially gender, male, female? Is it going to be ordinal, something like education level that goes up a hierarchy? Or is it going to be an interval measurement, which is usually what you generate from Likert scale surveys, or if you're doing a measurement, if you could have decimals as a possibility, usually it's interval. Okay, so even something like BMI, height, weight, those are interval. Then you want to pinpoint if you're going to use a self-report survey, or are you going to use archival data to collect your data. Don't use both methods. I would say just use one. And if you do use a survey, use a previously validated survey to save time. Then pinpoint your research design. Usually this is in the methodology. You need to say that you're running a quantitative method, but specifically what is the design? And we went through the 4 examples: exploratory, correlational, experimental, causal comparative. These kind of all go hand in hand. Longitudinal. Then you want to develop the research questions and hypotheses. And each of these research designs has a separate phrasing for how you should phrase the research questions. And then pinpoint specifically what is the best analysis to address. Okay, so we'll now do a Q&A session. If you have any questions, you can type those into the chat box. We will be sending a copy of the webinar and the PowerPoint. So yeah, let us know if we can be of any assistance. You can give us a call at 727-442-4290, or you can email us at info@statisticsolutions.com. All right, I do see we have some questions. I can't use the microphone with so many people, so I'm going to ask that you type them into the chat. I do see we had a question from Georgina. If you wouldn't mind typing it in. Any questions about research designs or research questions, hypotheses? What's the best analysis I should run? And you can see Sierra put many hyperlinks in the chat box as well. Just saw your question, Georgina. I can go back to the predictive designs. So that's over here. So a predictive design falls under, it depends on the university, but predictive falls under the correlational umbrella. So if you're doing a predictive design, these are the sample research questions here. So you say, is there a significant predictive relationship between X and Y? And then the specific analyses are down here, and the choice of what regression model. And regressions are the best approach to use when you're predicting. The choice of which regression model is dependent on how your outcome is measured. If you have a continuous outcome, you do linear regressions. If you have categorical outcomes, you do logistic regressions. If you have a two outcome, like passing and failing in an exam, that's dichotomous. That's when you do a binary logistic regression. If you have three or more possibilities, multinomial. And if your outcome is ordinal, that's when you do an ordinal logistic regression. Hey, Abdullah, we do not do classes, but if you have any questions, maybe we can help you hourly through one-on-one assistance. You can give us a call at the number below. Hey, Robert, can you explain the difference between correlation and association, if there is a difference in their tests? I usually see it's an overlap between the two. Correlation and association are synonyms statistically. So usually, if it's just correlational, then you're going to do one of these three analyses, most likely a Pearson correlation if everything's continuous. Okay, you can see I use even association here as well. So relationship and association and correlation, those are all kind of synonymous. Yeah, sure thing. Okay, we have a question from Hussein. I want to know the impact of training and surgery residents affecting the autonomic practice. I want to survey. So what design is appropriate? Usually impact of training, as soon as I see words like that, that implies you need to run an intervention. I don't know if that's your plan or not, but if you're testing the impact of a training, usually that involves giving a pretest and then running your training and then giving the same survey at post-test. So that would be most likely, that falls under the longitudinal design family. And if you have a treatment and control group, then it's a true experimental design. If you don't have a treatment and control, I would just call it longitudinal. You're welcome. We have a question from Robert. Is factorial analysis the method of determining if a new subscale is associated with an established scale? The factor analysis, there are a couple types. There's EFAs and there's CFAs. EFA is an exploratory factor analysis. And that is usually used when you have a new survey instrument and you want to see what are the different factors that the survey measures. Certain items grouped together, do 5 items measure one thing and 5 items measure another thing? That's usually when you run an EFA. And a CFA is used when you're looking, you have the factors already split up, so you know that 5 items connect. A CFA is usually done through prior literature. So it's already been established as a tool, and you want to make sure that the 5 items are connecting to one factor and 5 items are connecting to another factor. It's validating a previously used instrument. So if you want to determine if a new subscale is associated with an established scale, you most likely just need to run correlations. You need to run a correlation between the new subscale and the established subscale. Okay, if the instrument has already been validated, I would probably steer away from factor analysis. Okay. We have a question from Georgina. I have multiple course grades to predict Praxis 1 and Praxis 2 test scores. What design is best fit for this predictive relational study? I think you said it yourself. It sounds predictive. So that falls under the correlational umbrella. Over here, if you're doing this first, right here, this first sentence, you can see a correlational research is a design, and underneath correlational research you have analysis, correlational analyses, and you have regression analyses, which are predictive. So it's most likely a correlational predictive study, it sounds like to me. Hey, I'm glad it was helpful, Abdullah. Thanks for joining. Yeah, it was tricky for me as well when I first started looking at methods. They kind of overcomplicate it. It wasn't until I started running analyses, and then you can go backwards. You know, once you run your analysis, you're like, hey, that fits within this design. And then it kind of clicked for me. Yes, we will be sending a copy of the slides. First, we have to download the recording, but most likely tomorrow, we will be sending a copy of the slides and the webinar. Do we have any other questions? So the practice tests have multiple subtests and are multiple levels. All right, let me read your first question again. So you most likely need to do several regressions. That's what it sounds like. You would need to run a separate regression for every subscale or subfactor within the praxis. So whatever you're trying to predict, if the praxis measures multiple things, then you need to run a regression for each thing that the praxis measures. The number of regressions will be based on how many factors the praxis measures. So one regression per factor. Yep, you're welcome. All right. I'll stay on for a couple more minutes. Do we have any additional questions? All righty. Well, thank you for joining, and you can come join our future webinars as well. I did provide that hyperlink at the beginning of the presentation. If there's something else you'd like to check out, you can join us for the future webinars at the top bullet point here. And we're here if you have any questions. Have a great day.